Hello, I'm Olivia Poust, your host for this episode of One in Conversation. In researching for my article on the destruction of cultural heritage, which was published in the June edition of One, I spoke with Benedictine Father Columba Stewart, the Executive Director and CEO of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, also known as HMML. HMML digitizes and catalogs manuscripts from at-risk collections around the world. To date, the organization has preserved about 400,000 manuscripts, many of which are available to the public in its virtual reading room. The organization's mission truly is global, working with more than 800 libraries across 5 continents in countries such as Syria, Iraq, Italy, Ukraine, India, Ethiopia, and Mali to protect and preserve cultural and historical artifacts that are valuable to all of humanity. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Father Stewart. You can read more about the destruction of cultural heritage as a means to erase a group's shared culture, history, and identity in my article, Erasing Identity, in the June edition of One. Thank you for joining us. All right, perfect. So can you give me some background on how you came to be involved in HMML and this work?
So I am a monk of St. John's Abbey, and St. John's Abbey started the project in 1965. So obviously I wasn't involved then, I was only 8, but the monks started the project in the 60s during the Cold War because they were very much afraid of a World War III and the destruction of monastic patrimony in Europe. And the initial focus of activity was Austria, because Austria was a place where monasteries and other religious orders kept their manuscripts because they hadn't had the effects of a Reformation or the French Revolution there. So monasteries had these fantastic libraries. And at that time, Austria was a neutral country, kind of located between NATO in the West and then the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact in the East. And so that was a place that was very vulnerable in case of a ground war or nuclear conflict in Europe. So we started there, but very quickly it went to Ethiopia already in the 1970s. I got there just in time for their revolution, the overthrow of the emperor, and then the dictatorship and the resultant civil war, whose echoes continue to reverberate even today. And we've been back to Ethiopia, sort of in the last years as well, although we're not active there at the moment. But the conflict that's happening right now between Tigray and the rest of Ethiopia is a byproduct of that period in the 1970s. So worked in other European countries. The real sort of second chapter of HMML started in 2003, and that was the move to digital imaging from microfilm. And that was also our move toward Eastern Christian manuscripts more broadly, beyond the Ethiopian focus, starting in Lebanon. So we began the project in Lebanon in 2003, right around the time of the American invasion of Iraq. So we negotiated it before the invasion. We started it just after the invasion. And I became director that same year. I was involved in the Lebanon project, and then one thing led to another, and I ended up becoming director of all of HMML that September. And so the last 20 years have really been shaped by the post 9/11 landscape and the post 2003 landscape, and more recent conflicts, which have sort of been echoes of that or somehow related to that, like the Arab Spring, for example, affecting so many parts of the area where we worked.
Can you talk a little bit more about the actual process of digitization and what it looks like when you get to these collections?
Sure. So there are 2 important principles. One principle is that we train and pay local people to do the work. So we don't send in a kind of, American SWAT team to do all of this stuff. We want people to handle their own cultural heritage. So we don't actually physically handle the manuscripts. And this is important in these locations because in the past, foreign, European, meaning European and Americans, have come in and taken the stuff. So that's the British Library and the collections in France and Germany and the US. So they stay in place. We train local people to do the work. So there's a training workshop. We give them the equipment. We provide ongoing technical support. So they do the work. They put it all on hard drives. The hard drives come to us. We check the quality, and then we begin the process of data archiving and cataloging. So we have a team of catalogers in several countries around the world working through our online system. Some of them belong to the communities whose manuscripts are being digitized. Others are, scholars who approach this as an academic interest. And then it all goes online. So our vHimmel, virtual Himmel site is where we put things up. And we have agreements with each of the libraries we digitize that we're allowed to put them online for scholars, but they retain all publication rights and commercial rights. Mm-hmm. So if somebody wants to use an image on a book cover, they have to have the permission of the owner. If somebody wants to, somehow find a way to make money off manuscripts, which is not easy, if there is any income, it goes to the owners. It doesn't come to us. We're a nonprofit. We're funded by donors and grants, so we don't have any kind of commercial interest in the work. And we promise our partners that we'll keep the data forever. We do have an endowment, which supports about almost 30% of our operations, which means that no matter what happens with fundraising and other things, we'll at least have the resources to keep the data safe and available.
So are you normally pretty welcomed by these communities, or is there ever pushback? Or are they generally, because of the work, willing to?
All depends. Usually we have a member of the community who's an introducer, mm-hmm. or a trusted foreigner who is an introducer. Sometimes it takes more than one visit. We have situations where it's taken years of regular visits to build trust because, we're from abroad. American doesn't always help. I wasn't sure how that would work with either Orthodox or, even Muslim communities. In fact, it's kind of been a plus because, they regard me as belonging to a religious tradition. So I'm not I may be a kind of totally Western person and very modern, but at the same time, I'm not an anti-religious, super secular person. So that's something. And then nothing says not-for-profit like a Benedictine habit. So it's pretty clear that we're not there for any kind of commercial advantage or building up a resume or anything like that. And it's very interesting, even among Muslims, that old stereotype of the medieval monk copying manuscripts and preserving learning through the early Middle Ages. They know that stereotype, so it kind of works in our favor. I think lastly, I think they can see our record. They see we've worked with a number of communities and a number of linguistic and religious traditions across the Christian spectrum, different Catholic churches, different Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches, different types of Muslim communities. We haven't done any Hebrew manuscripts, by the way, because they've all been done. There's a project at the National Library of Israel, which has for many, many years been systematically photographing Hebrew manuscripts around the world. So that's why we talk about Christian and Islamic and a little bit of Buddhist and Hindu in South Asia, but we don't have to do Jewish tradition manuscripts because they're already covered.
Can you talk a little bit about the significance, even for Christians, of making sure that interreligious texts are preserved and that it's not just working for Christian manuscripts?
Well, places like the Middle East and South Asia, Christians have lived alongside Muslims since basically the origins of Islam and the conquests of the early Islamic period, and then later the Persian activity heading towards South Asia. So if we want to understand the life of Christians in these places, and obviously these are areas of great interest to Kanewa, their experience is one of living alongside people of another religious tradition. So if you want to understand them, we kind of need to understand more of the context in which they've lived. And thus we need to understand the the intellectual culture and the history of their Muslim neighbors. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that on a more, purely intellectual culture level, there was a lot of exchange. There were polemics, but there were also, more good-natured debates, exchange of literatures, stories, legends, folk tales that move from one religious tradition to another, from one language to another. And this is all showing the liveliness and interconnectedness of social and intellectual networks in the pre-modern era. Another part of it is that, today we think that nobody traveled till there were jet planes, and this isn't true. People have always traveled mostly for trade, sometimes for adventure. And by working with these manuscript libraries in what seem like wildly disparate locations, we can begin to map how manuscripts move and texts move, and therefore get an understanding of what types of intellectual exchange there would have been in that pre-modern era. And this is of great interest now to scholars who used to be narrowly trained, like I do medieval Western Europe. And so I learned Latin. And if I'm really edgy, I might learn Greek, or I might learn Old French or Old German. But of course, people doing medieval studies, you may be one of them. People doing medieval studies today are often learning Arabic, because so much of the Middle Ages in the West is conditioned by the awareness and sometimes conflict with Islam, whether it's the Iberian Peninsula or North Africa, later the Ottoman Empire. And equally, people who might have done, say, early Christian studies, which would be my background, who would have learned Latin and Greek to read church fathers, now learning Syriac, Armenian, et cetera, to understand the Eastern Christian experience beyond the very Hellenized cities of the Mediterranean coast. And the good news is we're able to serve all of those constituencies through these projects and help them make the connections that will, I think, enrich their scholarship, but also enrich our view of the pre-modern world. And, we always cross our fingers and hope that it might influence our view of today's world, that maybe there's something to learn from the past. So that would be the basic idea. And then just one last comment about what we can bring to the scholarly world is people have studied a lot of Eastern Christian traditions and many Islamic ones, mostly on the basis of manuscripts in Western libraries. So the stuff that the collectors and the plunderers took in the colonial era. So we're working with manuscripts that remained in situ, that remained with the cultures that produced them. And our hope is that'll round out the view of things and also bring the view more into the pre-modern, modern era, because Western scholars traditionally have been focused on old stuff. Like, I want the oldest manuscript. I want to know what it was like in the beginning. This sort of idea that, closer to the source or older is better or purer. And we don't think like that today. The evolution of things, the way things change, is also important. And so we can show, for example, Syriac manuscripts in the Middle East, that they're still writing treatises in Syriac and Neo-Aramaic well into the 20th century. And so it's a living culture. And that's a pretty nice complement to the antiquarian interest of traditional scholarship. And I mean, you guys know that because you're working with living communities. I mean, that's the whole point of your mission.
Right. Have you seen communities able to further connect with their own identity because of this digitization effort and kind of bringing some of these manuscripts back up to people's attention?
Well, I'd say there are two aspects to that. One of them is we're making it more available to their own people. So, anecdote. Old City of Jerusalem, we worked with several libraries, both Christian and Muslim families. And one of the prominent Muslim family libraries, the Budayri Library, and the Khalidi Library down the street, a similar situation. They have very good collections of Arabic manuscripts. And traditionally, their researchers, their patrons of the libraries, have come from the West Bank, which makes sense because they come from places like Ramallah and so on, because that's where the concentration of Palestinian population is. So when Israel built the separation barrier, they couldn't come to Jerusalem anymore. It's very difficult to get permission. So by putting them online, people who might live a mile away and couldn't see them otherwise if they weren't online. So that's important. And in other countries, they just can't get at the manuscripts because manuscripts are held by families or religious organizations that aren't functioning libraries. So you don't just show up and show your passport and get a reader's card like you can get at the British Library and look at an old manuscript. By putting them online, people in country can read them. But another thing that's a particular concern to the Eastern Christians in the Middle East, and again, you know this very well from your work, so much of their community is now in diaspora. Mm-hmm. So, they've got their young people in Europe or the States or Australia, and a lot of Copts and, Syriac Orthodox have gone to Australia. How do you keep them connected? And so you've got to be in the digital space. So, they have their satellite TV networks, which are great, especially on the Syriac side. But enabling younger members of those diasporas to get interested in their culture and maybe go and learn the languages and maybe go get a graduate degree and dedicate their life to the memory of their own tradition is really fostered by the worldwide availability of the stuff online.
I guess on the flip side of that, when we see so much destruction of cultural heritage right now and really across the world, what's the real danger of that and the risk of that loss?
Yeah, so Iraq's a good case in point. It's always had a fairly significant Christian population, largely Chaldean Catholic, but not only. 2003 was a major upset, and the forced population displacement that happened as a result of that, and the immigrations, and then the rise of ISIS in 2014 simply exacerbated the situation. So you have communities being disrupted, and in some cases forcibly removed, now trying to kind of put their life back together in their ancient villages, but that's extremely difficult. Many of them have already left. We also know that some manuscript collections during the ISIS occupation of northern Iraq were destroyed. They were fortunately ones that we had digitized. Others were miraculously hidden and have reappeared, but they're not physically accessible. And so again, the digital surrogate is really the only way to look at them. Syria, to the best of our knowledge, nothing that we digitized was destroyed. Things were evacuated to Lebanon. For the most part, that's what they did, or they simply hid them. But you never know. And there's always the ever-present danger, apart from war, of fire, which is the bane of libraries, which aren't, these kind of fancy Western libraries with clean agent fire suppression, climate and humidity control, all that kind of stuff. These places are often quite basic because that's what they can afford. So there's always that risk as well.
With the digitization of manuscripts, do you find that perpetrators of this kind of cultural destruction are less likely to then target the physical manuscripts if there's an awareness that it's not really erasing that history and that culture because it exists somewhere else? So while it is a huge historical loss to lose the physical manuscript, it's not that same erasure as if there were no digitization.
To be honest, I think the people who destroy this kind of stuff are not that sophisticated.
Mm.
They're going to destroy stuff because they like to destroy stuff. And, whether it's the Bamiyan Buddha sculptures or whether it's a library. And, remember that often this destruction happens within traditions. So in Mali up in Timbuktu, those were Muslim fighters destroying Islamic cultural heritage because it wasn't their flavor. And, of course, we Christians have done this over the centuries too. This is by no means something we're exempt from. And I think they just flatten what they see. So there's an element of rage and a kind of, I think, a primal desire for purity and erasure that digitization can never stop that or even ease that. But it can, however, balance out some of the effects of it by providing access to a digital surrogate of something that's been lost.
So does it seem like in the case of the manuscripts that it tends to be targeted attacks on those libraries and on the manuscripts, or does it tend to be that they're there kind of in the crossfire of conflict, or is it a mix?
I think it depends. I think up in Timbuktu in Mali, there was an effort because the libraries were famous. In most of these places, the libraries are not particularly famous, but a bishop or a monastery is going to have a library. And if people go into that library and see it's not, whatever they like, so it's not Quranic in the case of ISIS 2014, they will destroy it, just as they will deface the monastery and spray paint slogans on the walls, smash statues of the Blessed Virgin and the saints and this kind of thing.
Sure. Can you actually talk a little bit more about HMML's work in Syria and Iraq during ISIS's occupation? I'd like to know a little more about that presence.
So Syria, we started in 2004, so it was long before there was any sense of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was confident that Syria would be the most stable country in the Middle East forever because the Assad regime had such a tight grasp, which in one sense was true. Very effective interior intelligence service, tightly controlled population. When we would go to Syria, there was always somebody following us or asking follow-up questions from people we saw. So we were working there, pretty steadily from 2004 right through the beginning of their civil war in 2011. My last visit to Syria was March of 2011, which was a week before the riots began in southern Syria, which then, led to the horrible war and later the Russian intervention in Syria. And we kept working in Aleppo for about a year after the start of the war, wrapping up one last project. Fortunately, we had done most of what we were going to do there. Just saw what was happening to particularly our friends in Aleppo, which was our major center of activity, as well as Homs, because Homs was, brutally devastated in the conflict. And we worked with a very important Syriac manuscript collection there. So Iraq, of course, is a more complicated story. We came into Iraq in 2009, and we came to make contact with a Dominican friar, Najib Mikhail, who surely appeared in the pages of ONE. He's now the Chaldean Archbishop of Mosul. At that time, he was a Dominican friar, living at the priory in Mosul, although they had already moved the friars out of Mosul because there was a period of criminal kidnapping activity. And you could get more money for a priest than for a layman. And if you scored a bishop, that was best of all because you could really get a high ransom for that. So we had heard about him. He was very wary of working with Americans, but he knew we had a Benedictine connection. I first met him in Iraq in 2009, accompanied by two Lebanese Christians, who sort of helped in a way smooth the way. Enormously charismatic and energetic person who had been already doing digitizing work because he knew the situation was unstable, especially after 2003. So what we were able to do was, upgrade their equipment, do some new training, pay the workers at the center that he established, expand their activity. So that was all going well. They built a new priory in the village of Karakosh in northern Iraq, historically Christian village. I visited there often. And then we had the crisis of 2014. So, as you know from the history, ISIS seemed to appear out of nowhere. Nobody saw it coming. You wonder how, but that's how it felt. June of 2014, with the arrival of ISIS in Mosul, the fall of Mosul, and then August of 2014, moving east across the Nineveh plain, with ISIS hoping to capture Erbil, the Kurdish region capital, because that's a petroleum center. Well, they didn't get that far, but they devastated the Yazidi and Christian villages. throughout that region. And that part of Iraq is historically quite interesting because it also used to have ancient Jewish villages, which had been emptied during the 50s and 60s because of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that strand of religious pluralism in northern Iraq sadly was already gone. The next to go would be the Christians if ISIS succeeded, and the Yazidis, whom they regard as, of course, as heretical devil worshippers. So 2014, everything had to move to Erbil. Abu Najib got the manuscripts of his own Dominican priory safely to Erbil. Some others were hidden. The monastery Mar Benam, the monks hid the manuscripts behind a false wall that the ISIS occupiers never discovered. So they were rescued in Christmas of 2016 when the area was liberated. I went back in May of 2017 with CBS News. We had our 5 minutes of fame on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl. And with their security protection, we were able to visit the very recently liberated areas and even to go into Mosul, which was still half occupied by ISIS at that time. So they've been rebuilding since then, starting to go back to the villages, starting to get a better sense of what may have survived. But, again, fortunately, we had done so much of the work before the crisis hit. So when I would go back, I went back after 2014, sort of fairly soon after those events, to Erbil, where they had established refugee camps. And you all must have covered those at some point. So people displaced from the villages, from Mosul in the villages. So I would go back simply to provide, support and solidarity, show them we hadn't forgotten them. We're able to bring some practical assistance from some of our donors who wanted to make sure that people had food and could pay school fees and, gas for the bus to take the kids to school and this kind of thing. And then since then, as they've moved back into the villages, they're trying to rebuild some sense of traditional community and normalcy. Mm-hmm. And then Najib was made Archbishop of Mosul, which is ironic because there are no Christians in Mosul, or only a handful may have gone back. But as Archbishop, his territory covers all those ancient Christian villages. So he keeps busy.
So after conflict, kind of in this recovery period, how do people pick up the pieces and kind of reclaim their heritage, even if the physical element of their heritage has been destroyed?
The fundamental element of their identity is their faith and religious practice. So even in the refugee camps, they would have regular liturgies in unfinished buildings. They'd have these sort of shipping containers becoming residential quarters for them, and they would still gather. And so last time I was in Erbil, I remember when that was after that 2017 trip. They were running two sets of liturgies. They had a set of liturgies in Arabic for people from Mosul who were Arabophone, and also people who had been living in Erbil. And they had a whole other set of liturgies in Sureth, which is the Neo-Aramaic, descendant of Syriac, because that's what they did their liturgies in back in the village. And so they could still chant the hymns they all knew by heart. They could hear preaching in their own language. They could have their festivals and the feasts, and share food after liturgies. So this was really the center of their communal life. And without that, there would have been nothing to kind of keep them together. They all would have been looking for a way out. As it is, a number of their young people have sought to emigrate. Europe, Canada, some to the US if they have relatives who can sponsor them. Everybody has a cousin in San Diego. This is the kind of Chaldean situation, or Detroit. Detroit and San Diego are the big Chaldean centers. And obviously young people are most concerned about their future. The older people want to be home. Mm-hmm. And they want to retain some sense of the way they've always lived. But there's no question that the church is at the very heart of everything that they do. And, like everybody goes, young people, old people, families, it's very central.
considering all of these various locations where you've worked, and I guess beyond that as well, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between colonization and ethnocide and that desire to remove some of these items?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of examples.
Mhm.
Some of the most egregious, of course, are in Africa,
Mhm.
where, foreign colonial powers didn't even regard these as cultures. So the Benin bronzes, of course, is a huge issue in Britain, that they took these magnificent bronze pieces back to museums in the UK, and pretty systematically destroyed archaeological remains of West African kingdoms. Um, the French often had a kind of lighter touch in some ways, even though they were there for geopolitical reasons and resource extraction, just like the Russian mercenaries who are now there with the Wagner Group in Mali. They're there for the gold. So it's a sort of similar pattern with a different guise. In the Middle East, because you were dealing also with the presence of ancient Christian communities, which was not the case in West Africa, where you didn't have ancient Christian communities. The Western powers brought either Catholicism, or in the case of the British, Anglicanism or other Protestant churches. And so there was a sustained effort to convert Orthodox Christians, whether Eastern Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox, to the Catholic analogs. And of course, these Eastern Catholic churches, many of them were established during the colonial era to provide a home for people who became Catholic but wanted to keep their own liturgical traditions. And that's a very tangled history. And those churches are now, really trying to recover their authentic traditions and de-Latinize, because they were very much influenced by the Latin Catholic forces of the colonial powers. So it sort of looked different in different locations. So in the Middle East, the issue wasn't cultural erasure; it was, in the eyes of the Westerners, cultural evolution. You kind of upgrade them by making them Catholic, and therefore, more connected to the West and more enlightened, and this kind of thing, which of course is specious, but I think that was the impetus. One of the archives that we're currently digitizing in Rome is the archive of the Discalced Carmelites. And they were the most active missionaries in places like, Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, as far east as Goa. And their archives are fascinating because they tell the stories of the arrival of Catholic missionaries in these various places, and then the effort to convert Orthodox. They converted the Greek Orthodox bishop in Aleppo, for example. That didn't go over very well. So these are just really interesting stories of, people who really thought they were doing the right thing and just didn't really have an awareness of the full history and depth of these traditions, and therefore, appropriate respect for their traditions. So it's very clear when we go in now today, we're not there for missionary purposes, and we're not going to Islamic communities trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. That's not an issue anymore. We're meeting at a different level, mm-hmm. with a shared concern and interest for tradition, and an effort to make sure that tradition is not lost, but can find new ways to live. And that means digital. That's how stuff lives right now, for better or for worse.
You mentioned this, but there have been instances where the records or the manuscripts that you digitized, the physical versions, were lost. What is it like to hear of that? Knowing, I guess, that, yes, it's preserved here, but there's still this loss.
Well, it's horrible because, digital photographs can be really good, mm-hmm. but a manuscript is a three-dimensional physical object. Mm-hmm. And a photograph, even a very high resolution photograph, can't capture every aspect of it. So I do some work with manuscripts in my own scholarship. So particularly with Syriac manuscripts at the British Library, which is one of my favorite places. And, they just hand you a 7th century Syriac manuscript and let you spend the day with it. And I might have had scans of microfilms. I'm allowed to take my own photos now, so use your phone and snap the pages. And that gives me a lot of information, but you still find things when you work through the manuscript. There are details of the construction of the manuscript there. Maybe things in the gutter of the leaves of the manuscript that escape the photograph because it really can't get in there at the right angle. You can't just crack the book open to get a full view of what's inside. And things just hit you differently when you see them on a page as opposed to a photograph. There's more of a, so let's say you have a page that has a lot of notes on it or ownership inscriptions. You can see them all on the photograph, but on the manuscript page before you, it's like you can really see more clearly the different layers, like which was first, which was added later, how they were laid on the page. So it just gives you a different experience of it.
Right.
And so nothing replaces the original, so it's a loss. And it's also a symbolic loss for the community that a tangible link to their ancestors is no longer there.
What do you think can be learned from these centuries of attacks on heritage, and how can humanity better work to protect cultural heritage in the future, either with more efforts like HMML or something different?
I mean, when people say, what's the point of your work? I say, look, we're trying to find our way through a very complicated world, and we need as much help as we can get. We need as many clues as we can find. And, let us not be doomed to repeat the mistakes of our ancestors. Let us not be doomed to view ourselves as modern day crusaders trying to bring enlightenment. Let's be sensitive to the lived experience of these communities, including the minority Christian communities living among them, because I know that's a particular interest of Kanewa. So the good news is cultural heritage protection is really hot right now. Mm-hmm. So it's showing up in funding for efforts in the field. So, reconstruction, conservation, going to places like Syria and others where possible to protect things against future conflict or to rebuild them after. And so there's an awareness that, we have stuff that doesn't really belong to us. And there's no simple solution. I mean, you don't just, ship it all out because, where's it going to go? Who are the partners? But it's at least a moment for education and understanding and establishing new ties of relationship and exchange with the cultures of origin. So it's a pretty exciting space right now. And I just hope that, it continues to gain wider public recognition and that people will support organizations like ours.